Hey everyone, I'm in the midst of a really interesting experiment with Orchid W11. And I bought it on April 23rd, 2025, just about 2 months before I stumbled upon the concept of CAM photosynthesis, which I've been sharing with you. So this one was no different from all the other ones that I bought at Wegmans. It had beautiful flowers, it had buds that hadn't formed yet, and there was a preponderance of them. So my plan was to put it in a very wide container, keep it in the root ball, and just let it dry out and hope for the best. So about a week later, the flowers started to wilt, and I had no idea what was the cause of the wilting. Unaware of the damage to the metabolism that overwatering had done to the plant, I blamed myself for not watering it enough. So I added fuel to the fire by watering it even more. And wouldn't you know, all the flowers continued to wilt and the buds started blasting all over the place. So there were about 3 straggling flowers left for about 2 months. And so that's the story with this one. Around the beginning of July, I just completely stopped watering it. And the root ball dried out like the root balls of R1 through 4 that you've already seen. Orchids R1 through 4. And so the root ball dried out for about a month. So here in my notes, it says for Wednesday, August 6th, that's this past Wednesday, that I soaked the root ball for 2 hours and I repotted it. So the root ball being soaked for 2 hours was done to soften up all of the moss, which become, hard like a big cork. And in that way, I could peck away at it with my fingers and the tweezers and remove all of the moss and finally get something like this, where all the roots were finally free of the moss. So as you can see, it's now August 10th at 9:16 p.m. So this morning at 7 p.m. I had an idea. I'm sorry, I meant to say this morning at 7 a.m., which was to soak this poor thing, which hadn't received water for a long time now. Prior to August 6th, it hadn't received water for a month. So I figured I'd, start out this morning and soak it for 12 hours and see what the result would be. And what I did is I weighed the orchid in the vase, then I weighed the vase, then I subtracted that weight from the orchid in the vase, and the orchid then weighed 4.5 ounces. Well, I added the water about halfway up the roots, and then I figured, after 6 hours, let me check and see what's going on. So after 6 hours, it gained 0.5 ounces. So that was basically from 7 to 1 p.m. And then what's interesting, in the next 6 hours, in other words, this says after 12 hours, meaning going from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So we're now at 7 p.m. here. So in that second 6 hours, it only added 0.2 ounces. So now bells are going off in my head, and I'm realizing that even though this plant needs a lot of water, perhaps in this 12-hour period, there's a limit to how much water it can take in. So I've decided to extend it another 12 hours, and we'll come back tomorrow morning and see how much it takes in the next 12 hours. So please stay tuned. Okay, we're back. It's Monday, August 11th at 6:58 a.m. So what I'm going to do is weigh everything here. The orchid, the vase, the water, and then I'll remove the orchid and That'll leave me with the vase and the water, and then I'll subtract that from the original weight and we'll know exactly what the orchid weighs. There we go. And the whole thing weighs 53.8. And now I'll just pop the orchid out. Shake it off. Put it in this holding bin over here. Let's take a look at the weight now. And that's 48.5. Okay, so 53.8 minus 48.5 is 5.3. And we looked at the figure for yesterday at 7 p.m. after soaking for 12 hours, and the orchid weighed 5.2. So in the next 12 hours, there's only been a gain of 0.1 ounces. So this is becoming really interesting, and I have to say, a little unexpected. So what I'd like to do is carry this experiment through another 12 hours, and then we'll have 2 days where we can do exact comparisons. So just like yesterday, I'll come back after the first 6 hours at around 1 p.m., check the weight, and then we'll finish the whole thing 7 p.m. tonight. So I'll be back in about 6 hours. Okay, we're back, and it's Monday, August 11th at 12:57 p.m. So here we go, 6 hours later. The scale is set, I thought it was. Scale is set to 0. Here comes the orchid. And the whole thing with the water is sitting there. And the whole thing weighs 53.6. And now I'll remove the orchid. Put it over here for now. And let's check out the weight. The weight without the orchid is 48.3. Okay, so 53.6, which was everything together, minus 48.3, the weight of the vase and the water, leaves us 5.3 for the weight of the orchid. And this is very surprising. So let's do a quick summary. We began with the orchid weighing 4.5 ounces. After 12 hours of soaking yesterday, we added another 0.7 ounces. And then after 24 hours going into Monday morning, we gained another 0.1 ounces, making that 0.8 ounces. And then from this morning at 7 a.m. to this afternoon at 1 p.m., there was 0 gain. So from this new data, I'd like to ask you if you have an opinion about what's going on here. Meanwhile, I'll sign off and I'll see you tonight at around 7 p.m. And in that way, we'll have 2 full 12-hour days to draw comparisons between. So I'll see you in 6 hours. Hi everyone, we're back again. It's Monday night, 7:03 p.m. So this will be our last weighing of Orchid W11. So let's get started. Okay. Everything's on there, the orchid, the water, the vase, and the whole thing weighs 53.5 ounces, that is. Let's remove the orchid. kind of wedged in there. We'll put it over here. And let's take a look at the vase now with just the water that's remaining. And we have 48.1. So we have 53.5 for the weight of everything minus 48.1, which is just the vase and the water, and that leaves us 5.4 for the weight of the orchid. So let's look at the data of the entire experiment, and then I'll give you my conclusions. So, after 36 hours, Orchid W11 absorbed approximately 0.9 ounces of water. The majority of the water, 0.5 ounces, was absorbed in the first 6 hours of the experiment on Sunday morning. Another 0.2 ounces was absorbed during the second 6-hour period of the same day, for a total of 0.7 ounces absorbed in the first 12 hours. So in the first 12 hours, this good-sized orchid with 5 pretty large floppy leaves and 1 new stiff leaf, and all of these roots managed in a 12-hour period to absorb just 0.7 ounces of water. For the next 12-hour period, spanning from 7 p.m. Sunday evening to 7 a.m. Monday morning, a negligible amount of 0.1 ounces was added, bringing the total amount of water absorbed in that 24-hour period to 0.8 ounces. The next paragraph describes something that I never really mentioned to the members of the group, and which I had read about, and it was kind of a duh moment for me. And what I mean by that is, up to this time, I failed to take notice of the importance of that information. So as a result of that information, these findings are predictable because we're dealing with an orchid that uses CAM photosynthesis. And it's customary for the greatest intake of water to take place from sunrise to about noon. And in this case, it was 0.5 ounces. And at that point, the stomata are beginning to close down. And the orchid is trying to get as much water as it can into its roots. Now, during the afternoon, when the stomata are completely closed, the intake of water diminishes markedly. And in our case, it diminished from 0.5 ounces to 0.2 ounces. And it's during this time period that the process of photosynthesis begins in earnest. So it makes sense. Now, I just want to point out that the results for the entire day of today, Monday, are pretty insignificant. And let me show you those results. So we're talking about a gain of 0.1, then a gain of nothing, then a gain of 0.1. And these differences can easily be attributed to a rounding error because I can only get tenths of an ounce on my scale. So what I'm trying to say, if the scale reflected hundredths of an ounce, this 5.3 could very easily have been 5.39 or 5.38, but we don't know. So to get from this figure of 5.3 to 5.4 might have reflected the difference of 2 to 300ths of an ounce instead of a full tenth of an ounce. And it's also possible that when shaking the water off here, I could have shaken off more than I did here, which would explain the discrepancy between the 5.3 and the 5.4. So that's a possibility. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that for the day Monday compared to the day Sunday, there is an insignificant change in the amount of water absorbed by the orchid. If anything, it was something between 0 and 0.1 ounces. Getting back to the conclusions, the most telling part of the experiment occurred this Monday morning from 7 a.m. to 1 p.m., where there should have been a gain commensurate with Sunday morning's gain. However, surprisingly, no more water was absorbed during this period, indicating that the orchid had arrived at a maximum saturation weight. It was perhaps the orchid's way of saying, "I've had enough water, thank you. Now leave me alone and let me go about my business." So I don't want you to get confused here. This orchid still has a long way before it finally achieves its maximum saturation weight. As you can see, the leaves are still floppy and in need of water. So this ultimate maximum saturation weight is something that I can't tell you. I don't know what it is at this point, and I don't know how long it'll take to get there. That's why I'm doing all of these experiments. So now you're seeing that you can view these orchids like little factories. And to be more specific, they're sugar factories. That's what they're producing. That's what's being produced by photosynthesis. And in a given period, like 24 hours, or whatever period you choose, it can only take in a maximum of resources, simply because there's a limit to how much sugar it can produce in that same period. Lastly, the data forces us to confront the elephant in the room, which is water culture itself, which espouses the theory that soaking the roots of a cactus-like plant for days at a time is somehow beneficial for it. So in the end, what this experiment demonstrates is the idea that anything other than a relatively strict application of water culture of no more than 8 to 12 hours is unnecessary. So thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I realize it was a long one, but the information turned out to be extremely valuable.